So once they get to the next level, there's no difference, meaning like pro level. It's the only delineating factor is mental. They're all the same. They're all just as skilled. They're all skilled from a throwing perspective, right? I would argue many of the college guys that we have in here, because we can have our MLB guys downstairs. Their favorite day is when they get to come and watch the college guys throw, because these guys light up the radar gun. The biggest difference is the MLB guys and the minor league guys can perform when the lights are on 24/7, and they don't only throw hard, they know how to pitch. Hey guys, this is Dr. Nicholas Serio from VeloU, and welcome to the Baseball Playground.
Welcome back to the Baseball Playground. This is your host, Jacob Odell.
And I'm Coach Matt McGowan.
Today we have an awesome guest, the founder of VeloU University, Dr. Nick, who is just phenomenal with the content that they put out online, teaching you how to become a better pitcher, a better man, and overall a better baseball player. Dr. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate that.
Dr. Nick, when I found out that you were going to be on the show, I did a ton of research and I just kept getting super fired up about, all the questions I'm going to ask you. So the first one that I have to ask is, how important is video of a particular pitcher?
You mean in
the recruitment process,
it?
Right? Like them breaking down mechanically, breaking down their kinetic chain, which I want to get into, definitely the kinetic chain and everything like that. But, we're big believers in video and we feel that helps the recruitment process. What do you see on your side? Because I bet you're videotaping everybody every session.
Yeah, so we use video a lot, but video is used from an array of different perspectives, right? So from a training world, we're using video not only so that the coach can, slow time down, right, and get a better understanding of how this person is actually moving, but we can also use it from a visual aspect in terms of communicating with the athlete and looking at, just sort of how their energy is flowing. I think some of the risks with video, especially from a training perspective, is segmenting a video and talking about one particular part without taking into context how they got to that certain position that you want to say is either good or bad. And then ultimately how the energy is flowing through that position is really what ends up mattering more than anything. I think mechanics in a nutshell are a crock of shit. And I think even using the word mechanics, because of how butchered it's been sort of in this industry, sets this sort of platform for judgment between, the coach and the athlete at that point in time. So the moment you're going to start talking about mechanics, the athlete immediately feels, okay, I'm going to be judged on how good, how bad, or, vice versa, what I'm doing in general. So yes, we use video a lot. We are not bound to the video. A lot of times we want to try and draw out of the athlete what it is they're feeling. And when you're doing that, you'll also get a very good understanding of how was this athlete previously coached? Because a lot of times we're getting guys that are coming from somewhere else, or, they're in a college program and maybe they've just been fed bad, not necessarily advice, but sort of just like, this is what you're doing wrong. Not necessarily like, hey, okay, great. How do I fix it? And now they're left to, finding pages like ours, like Tread, like, all these other accounts and trying to like decipher, well, is that exactly what I do wrong? So should I be following this? And that's my beef with social media, is it's really impossible to try and give this whole context of what it is you actually need to be doing.
So then let me ask you this. What do you think a high school player or college player should be doing then if they're falling into exactly what you just said?
Throw as often as humanly possible. You cannot throw hard without throwing hard intent at some times in your life. It shouldn't be every day, but it should probably be more than you think. And throwing at a high intent doesn't mean getting on a mound and pitching in a game. It just means challenging your body to try and balance between, hey, am I coasting or am I actually testing my limits and then recovering? I I know that's an oversimplified answer there, but the true answer, without like, hey, plugging us, plugging, I mean, all of these places are great. So that's the other thing. Like thinking that we're better than Tread or Tread's better than us or some of these drive lines better than us or this. At the end of the day, you're splitting hairs as long as those individuals understand, human kinetics and essentially the actual action. But at the end of the day, you should just go with whoever you have the best connection with and that you can communicate easiest with, because ultimately that's what an athlete needs is they need to be evaluated. You can't do anything without understanding your starting point. And if you don't understand where you're starting from, you're just guessing and you're going at it blindly.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Talk to us about you brought up the kinetic chain and how can you tell if a pitching coach actually does know the kinetic chain? Because there's a ton of, we're in Los Angeles. There's so many pitching coaches from Timbuktu to, oh, I played in the majors, I did all this stuff, and put a bag on his hand and go like this. You're gonna throw harder. A bunch of guru type stuff.
Sure.
Talk to us about how can you tell if someone's kind of a bullshitter or not?
Well, so having an understanding of gross anatomy, I think, is super important. When I say gross anatomy, like you don't got to understand the nuances of like cellular breakdown and like protein synthesis, right? Like
Yeah.
we need to understand, generally how are the joints interacting, how are the muscles, and then ultimately the fascia, right, controlling all of this interaction. You can probably get an understanding pretty quickly just based on their vernacular and like the language in which they use. But also too, you got to be careful because guys can throw out buzzwords, right? Like,
hear that all the time.
I'm working on proprioception because I'm using a water bag, and like I'm working on my, I don't know, I'm trying to give you 1,000 different ways that like we've heard all of these different things. And listen, we're guilty of them too, right? It's the nature of social media. You're trying to say something within the first 3 seconds to attract somebody so that they can actually listen to the bulk of what you're trying to get across. But at the end of the day, the kinetic chain is nothing more than how does energy transfer through this individual. And ultimately what you need to decide is first you need to address, how do they transfer energy? And then you can address, well, if they don't transfer energy very well, is there potential to create energy lacking, or is there potential to absorb energy lacking? And that may be one and the same, but it is an important question to ask. And then ultimately, the final piece is, you could probably start with this, but what is their genetic makeup? Because ultimately, that's going to determine a lot. And does it mean that, if your dad's 5'5" and, you all of a sudden come out and for some reason you're 6'2", that you're going to be limited because he was 5'5"? No, but we do need to understand that there are genetics that we just can't outrun at certain points in understanding this. But in a nutshell, the kinetic chain is just energy transfer. It's understanding how energy transfers ultimately from the ground to the hand. And there is a process by which that goes, which is just basically segmental multiplying, which just means like if I can take the energy that I produce into the floor will then obviously produce that energy back into me. Yeah. As a caveat here, I should say that I think the legs are massively overblown in terms of their importance in pitching. But for that, I will say that the energy that I'm taking from the ground needs to make its way towards the pelvis in enough to allow me to capture the momentum of the slope. And then ultimately my torso is going to decide what I can and can't do. It's going to make up to 86% of the work or energy that's going to go towards the hand. So we must understand how important the position, the capacity to capture the momentum, and ultimately the most important part is the timing. Because you can see guys that have small ranges, you can see guys that have big ranges. All that matters at the end of the day is, can they time it up well?
Absolutely. Makes total sense. One thing I was going to comment, though, is if your dad's 5'5" and you're 6'2", the mailman is probably also 6'2".
Yeah.
So
Or mom is. Yeah, I was just trying to not rain on anybody's parade if their dad's only 5'5".
I
So
love it. I love it.
For sure. You had touched on something that I want to dive into because it sounds a little bit of your philosophy, but you said that the legs are overblown. What do you mean by that? What's your philosophy on legs through the kinetic chain?
So we've gone down the route and rabbit hole with unbelievable athletes of like, hey, based on your hip functionality, the way your bias in terms of, so the way the hip and pelvis form, right, is it going to be either antiverted, retroverted, right, which means you're going to either have a bias towards internal rotation or external rotation, right? This then would weigh on theoretically how your force can be dispersed from the ground, just because of how well the joint is going to be articulating when you're going into some of these positions. Sure, that matters slightly. And what I'll say to that is, how are you testing that in the first place? Right. So we have tested it from a packed position, which means when the foot is on the ground, we're testing that, or from a unpacked position where it's like more passive and we're checking those ranges of motion. We have had guys that have fit that model. We have had guys that have blown that model out of the water and still throw 97. So whenever you're trying to formulate a model or a theory, just understand that when you're starting to deal with the best, they will completely mess that up, because they are probably the greatest compensators in the world, and they're going to find ways to do things that theoretically shouldn't be able to be done. Now, getting back to like, why do I think the legs are overblown? I really think the job of the lower half is to generate initial momentum and create a stable platform for the torso to rotate at an extremely high velocity. If you are incapable of creating this platform or this foundation at the pelvis region, your torso is going to be left to being either slow as a mover because it doesn't feel stable and it doesn't feel like it has the freedom to do so, or it's going to try and balance itself by switching off over the pelvis and not allowing itself to grab all the energy possible towards the direction you want to go. So why do I think the legs are overblown? I think a lot of people talk too much about needing to uncoil the back hip at the right time, needing to leap off the mound, needing to hinge heavily. And I think it ultimately causes too much of an internal focus on the lower half. And you cause players to be over dramatized with what is going on in my lower half, which I'll get back to sort of the other point that you made there with like, hold this water bag and it's going to make you, throw 95. So every tool is as full of shit as it is positive for an athlete. And the reason I say that is if the tool becomes a crutch, you're no longer in a routine or a practice, you're in a ritual. And once you've crossed into a ritual, it's a very dangerous world to be in, because the moment that doesn't happen, you're going to be mentally weak heading into whatever you're trying to head into. Do water bags help? Yes, at times. They can be very useful. Is it proprioception? Yeah, to an extent, that is what you're working on. But honestly, where we focus the most with water bags is the athlete's capacity to be connected to the floor. So we're really focused on their balance from the back foot. If the foot is not well ingrained with the floor, even though you're wearing a cleat now at this point, but if the foot is not well ingrained with the floor, you don't stand a very good chance of creating a stable pelvis above.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I think you're absolutely right. Once it becomes, routine, or ritual, like you said, it becomes dangerous, because if you can't do it, then it's, you're psyching yourself out before the game even starts. I want to talk about facilities, right? Your facility has some amazing technology, amazing things to help their athletes. Talk about your facility, but then also talk about what kids that maybe can't afford to go to your facility, what they can do to just better themselves.
Well, I will certainly get to my facility, but to your last point there, there's a running joke here that our remote athletes are better than our in-house athletes.
Love
And
it.
that's simply because the average velocity on our remote guys is higher than our average in-house athlete. That may have something to do with where we are located in the country, but it's real. So does TrackMan, does Stalker, does I don't even know, force plates, Kaiser equipment. I mean, you name it, we have it. Do they help? They certainly do if you are going to understand how to use them, understand what they're telling you, and understand that the human mind is stronger than any data point that you can ever find. So we can have guys. One of our guys that's in the MLB right now has some of the most lackluster force plate metrics you've ever seen. But he can still throw 95 on a mound and is an unbelievable pitcher. So have we been able to make some connections with force plate output into like ball velocity? Yeah. Is it always true? No. Just like I said before, if you're going to try and make a perfect model, just get ready for it to be blown up. And if you want to be ignorant to when it's blown up, then you'll claim you have a perfect model. But if you want to be real about it, you'll understand that there's no such thing.
Where is the mile per hour going to be in 10 to 15 years? We're already seeing 100 miles an hour, 102, 105. Is it going to get higher than that? Is it going to be in the 110s? Is that possible? Like, is the kinetic chain going to allow players to throw that hard? What do you think it'll be in 10 to 15 years?
So I think what's pretty cool is when you look at shoulder velocities, right? As you get more proficient, meaning like at a higher level, you actually see the shoulder velocities go down. So like an elite level pro is going to have a slower shoulder velocity or internal rotation speed than, let's say, a minor leaguer or certainly than a college and high school level athlete. And the reason is they're just better at transferring energy all the way to there. So I bring that up because could we see, 110? I'm sure there's somebody out there that, like Usain Bolt says, has that shit that you just can't teach.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden is going to be born with a blessed arm and, can throw that hard. Yeah. I think what you'll probably see is what you've been seeing. I think you'll see innings continue to go down because I think you'll see velocity averages continue to rise. And I think you'll see the gaps start to rise. You're already seeing it. Division III, Division II gaps are closing in on D1 gaps, right, in terms of velocity. And that's going to continue to be the case, especially with the portal open, especially with guys not being able to get to some of these big time schools, frankly, because they're recruiting or they're bringing in, 8 grad transfers as opposed to taking a risk on a, 17-year-old kid.
Yeah, no, the transfer portal has completely changed the recruitment process and just being able to, like you said, take a risk on a kid that probably definitely deserves it. And 10 years ago would have been, a guy that they had begged to come to their school. It's definitely changed.
So as you're having these players that are coming to you looking for a college to select, or maybe it's some of the college players that you already have that are looking to transfer and go to a new place, what are some of those conversations looking like from your perspective on advice that you give them on making that decision to go to which school?
Cool. So first thing right out the chute is we plead with every kid to go somewhere where they're wanted deeply. And from there, the next decision is compare yourself to the others that are already there to decide what your impact is going to be. Going into college nowadays, assuming you're going to be playing all 4 years at that same school, I think is naive for a multitude of reasons on either side, right? Whether the athlete can level up or whether the team just feels they're not at that level anymore. So I think that's a really tough thing because there's a huge mental transition that happens, right, when you go from high school to then college, which is it's really the first time in your life that you have switched from a game to a business. And if you're lucky enough to go beyond that, it's the next time you'll see what a real business operates like. So at the college level, a lot of these kids get their first idea of what it means to have to perform at all times. There's no days off. There's no period of time where somebody isn't watching. And I think understanding that and deciding, knowing a kid is super important for us, right? Like learning him from an emotional perspective, him from a mental perspective, him from a work ethic perspective is super important when trying to help him decide what college they want to go to. Simply because if we have other guys there, we can get a feel for what that atmosphere is like and, whether or not this kid is going to be cut to really hang there or contribute.
Absolutely. You have major leaguers that you work with, you have minor leaguers that you work with, you have college guys that you work with. Out of those guys that throw roughly around the same miles per hour, what do you see as the biggest difference in either their work ethic, their philosophy, or the way they go about their business?
So once they get to the next level, there's no difference, meaning like pro level. It's the only delineating factor is mental. They're all the same. They're all just as skilled. They're all skilled from a throwing perspective.
Yeah.
Right. I would argue many of the college guys that we have in here, because we can have our MLB guys downstairs. Their favorite day is when they get to come and watch the college guys throw because these guys light up the radar gun. The biggest difference is the MLB guys and the minor league guys can perform when the lights are on 24/7, and they don't only throw hard, they know how to pitch. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the biggest delineating factor is how well can you manage your mental landscape? And, understanding that isn't just happening when you're stepping between the lines, the further up you go. The further up you go, that's happening every single day. And, I would say from our MLB guys, 99% of the conversing that I am doing with them throughout a year has to do with the mental landscape as opposed to anything physical that they're going through.
We talk a lot about mental approach on the show, and we have a lot of people that come on the show who talk about teaching mental toughness, right? And I honestly don't think that it's like a teaching in the sense. It's like for some people, you either have that mentality where you just want to get after it, you're competitive, and for some others, they just aren't. What is your take on some of the people who maybe need a little more push to become mentally tough?
Yeah, so you're not wrong. In fact, there is no way to teach mental toughness because it's not a tangible asset, right? So the only thing you can do is provide opportunities, and then you can nudge somebody to take that opportunity. That's about it. And if they take the opportunity and they learn about themselves, then they can become mentally tough. But understand that too is subject or domain dependent, right? Like I can be extremely mentally tough when it comes to reading, right? Like maybe I really struggle at reading and I have to push myself through these things. And for that, I feel like I've become very mentally tough at, enduring something that is really strenuous and tedious, right? Whereas if it came to maybe working out, maybe my mental toughness at working out was just really poor. So, listen, we deal with guys too from an array of socioeconomic, cultural backgrounds, right? And you deal with their upbringing defines most of their personality characteristics. A lot of this is set in stone. You're just trying to bring them to the surface, and teach them how to use the emotional energy that they have in a constructive way. So, I may have a guy that is immensely mentally tough on the mound, but hates the weight room. And my job isn't necessarily, and like, here's the biggest mistakes from most coaches is like, oh, I see the easy route where I can make a major change in him and think like, that's what I have to push him in. Not necessarily. There might be a reason he doesn't respond well to the weight room. And I'm not saying that we don't try and get him to be more entrenched in it, but we have to get him to create his own buy-in. Me berating him that he's fat or he's lazy or he's out of shape, but yet he can go on the mound and carve, throw 92 to 95 and is highly touted, that doesn't make any sense. So I think mental toughness is domain dependent, and I agree with you completely. There is no teaching it. There is providing opportunities and then forcing somebody to take that opportunity.
Where are you seeing kids come from location-wise? You said you do remote. Are there a lot of California guys? Are there a lot of, New York guys? Where are these kids? Where are you seeing the best results from the kids in what location?
I mean, to be honest, it would be really easy to come on here and be like, oh, blue collar all the way, and like those guys got it, but it's just not the case. There are some blue collar guys that got it, and like they just come from, either whether it's a generation or a family where like, yeah, they're going to grind and they're going to get it. And then there's some kids that come from really wealthy areas and really like, but they want it just as bad, if not more. And if they have more resources, it's going to be really tough for the blue collar guy to keep up. And so it is really diverse, and it is really person dependent. And I think that's why you see such a spread when you see a draft or when you see, listen, we're in Westchester. It's one of the wealthiest counties in the country. And yet we're still pumping out MLB draft picks in the first round, like every year. And so, it's really person dependent. But ultimately you have to look no further than their house.
When we're talking about getting people seen, because that's pretty much the majority of what we're here to do, is to help people get seen, help them get recruited eventually. Once
understand the process.
And understand the process and make it easier. So my question for you is, do you think that facilities like VeloU are going to start playing a way bigger role in the recruiting process because you guys are videotaping everything, because you guys are more hands-on, and you guys are able to have a wider spread network based upon what you know and also what is happening on social media?
Yes, we already do. So we post a kid. I think unfortunately I was at a wake or a funeral, and I got a text message from an ACC coach saying, is this kid so-and-so for real? I had no idea what he was talking about. Unbeknownst to me, we had bullpens that day. And apparently one of our kids threw on Twitter, and within minutes, I had a text. And to be honest, I hadn't really spoken to this coach much prior. I was actually shocked I had his number in my phone. So, yes, we're going to play a way bigger role. Facilities will play a way bigger role. I think summer teams play a huge role, right? I think the connection between summer teams and facilities is super important so that everybody can be on the same page, because ultimately at the end of the day, I understand their dynamic, because we can't forget about the business side of it, right? I understand their dynamic. They need to be successful. So they need to have great players, right? And we get that. Our objective is singular. We want to make the player as good as humanly possible, right? So we have a very close-knit, sort of co-joining quest that we're both seeking right here. The idea is we just need open communication with the suppression of a lot of egos, right? To understand that all we're trying to do is put this kid in the best spot possible to be seen and to prosper and not get hurt.
What is the ideal age where you want to get, or grade, you want to get your hands on a kid and start the development process?
13.
Why?
Because they haven't been overcoached. So if they haven't been overcoached, it's a lot easier. It does take a lot of buy-in from the parent, because we're not cheap, and that's a long road to go. But if you have the resources, make the sacrifice, because the amount of kids that I can show you that we have started with at age 13 and are now either committed or playing in the ACC is ridiculous. And it is simply because they are getting high level coaching from a young age, and they're making leaps and bounds ahead of other guys when, I mean, listen, I have a 9-year-old, right, who I have to plead to play a sport, like try to get him off of a video game, try and get him into something. When you have a 13-year-old who wants to be committed and wants to put in the effort that it takes to do this, heed that message. Start young. Do not waste. It is so difficult for me to get a kid, our team, to get a kid that's already 15, 16 years old in committed or recruitable shape in a 3-month window, 6-month window. That's really challenging. And if you can give us a kid at age 13, I promise you the number one message you're going to hear from us if they start at age 13 is less playing, not as much. He doesn't need 80 games over the summer. He doesn't need 50 tournaments where he's showcasing in front of X, Y, and Z. He doesn't need that. He needs to understand how to train. He needs to understand his body. He needs to understand freedoms, and he should have the ability to play a multitude of things at that young age.
Do you think that kids are playing too much?
I think kids are playing too often. And I think that's the nature of probably where I live in New York. We have a very short window to try and get all these games in. So the often is probably like the frequency of play is probably worse than the volume of play across the year. Because, they're at a young age, right? They're pitching, and then they have a game the next day. So they're going to go play the field. Let's say they have a really smart coach and they're going to DH. They're going to play the field the next day, right? And understanding the missed opportunities to even train in there, I think is what's even bigger of a miss. So I don't necessarily think that they're playing too much. I think they're playing way too often. I think, and I think a lot of times too, we get back to the business side of it. I think summer teams are in a tough route there, right? Because they're constantly trying to prove that they have the pull or the viewership necessary to get your son to the next level, right? That's ultimately why you're playing with that summer team.
Yeah.
And I think for that, they should be paid very well if they can do that. And they can showcase you well. However, I think how they try and make up a lot of that or keep even is that they book all these games during the week too that are like meaningless bullshit games in front of nobody. And that's where you get into this like frequency/volume issue.
We see a lot of travel teams, since we're on this topic, of travel teams, summer ball teams, where they're separated into, the gold, silver, and bronze tier teams, or gold, navy blue, whatever it may be, right? So do you think that a kid playing on that lowest team should necessarily be even a part of that team if they're not getting the highest end exposure, or if they're just the ones that are helping out the program's, finances, and that's what actually is, making the business run? What are your thoughts on how those travel teams are in the 3-level tier breakdown?
Well, so I have a reasonable solution to that, and it just goes towards resorting some of the funding, right? So like if you have kids that are, let's just call it level 1, 2, and 3, right? 1 being the top. If you have a kid that's in level 3, he shouldn't be playing as much as the kid in level 1. Like he shouldn't be showcasing, he shouldn't be on display. He should be training so that he can get to level 1. Yeah. Practice and train so that he can get to level 1. Most of the time should be spent there. Those coaches that you have at that level should be the best at that, not necessarily the best game managers. And, I think that's a better route as long as you can convince parents that they understand that. And that is always the biggest struggle, right? Our problem at the end of the day, we've said it before this podcast. I'll say it time and time again. If somebody were to ask, like, what's your biggest obstacle to exponential growth? It's education. It's not like internal education. It's educating our populace on what they should likely be doing and why we feel that way.
No, absolutely. And I think it's, as a high school coach, dealing with parents and dealing with egos, right? And them living through their kid. And, hey, we don't need to play in this tournament. We should practice more. We should do this stuff. That's what's best for your kid. Some of
Yeah.
them don't realize that because everyone wants to keep up with the Joneses, right? That's the old saying, and unfortunately, it's not healthy, and I don't think it helps a lot of kids.
I think ultimately what ends up happening is the same thing with social media and the misconception that like, oh, I'm scrolling through social media to try and find the fix for why I'm not throwing hard, right? And I'm going to rely on stuff that's worked for other people and assume that that will work for me, right? And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's the same thing parents are doing, right? They're looking at what other successful baseball players are doing and assuming that's what their kid needs to do, except they're probably missing a whole host of that roadmap in that assumption, right? And furthermore, for most parents, the biggest issue. I was a baseball coach for 11 years, 12 years. The biggest issue you run into is that a lot of the parents are wildly successful in an array of fields. And the assumption is that that success spills over into anything you do, which is obviously a grave misconception. And, unfortunately, this is a very intricate, while simple, intricate path that an athlete needs to go on. And it isn't as easy as just like, oh, well, let's follow the former kid that was a first round draft pick.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. You have to tailor it to what's best for your child. Speaking of tailoring things, where do you see injuries happening? Do you see it more happening throughout the year with their high school coach? Do you see it during the summer? Do you see it because injuries happen, and that's the reality of baseball. It happens. For California kids, I think, a lot of the higher tier high schools, I think they play too much. They throw a lot of innings and I mean, it's fall. Kids are throwing 6 innings. It doesn't make any sense to me. But you see them get injured, and then you go, oh well, that makes sense because you've thrown 60 innings in a fall. So talk to us about that. What do you think a good inning range would be in a fall, maybe a winter? Obviously your location determines that, but what do you think?
Well, we see injuries happen in 2 distinct parts of the year, no matter where you're playing. And that is like at the start of a season and at the culmination of a season, right? Or an extended version of the season, i.e. fall baseball. So you're seeing injuries happen here the most because the beginning stages are guys that were not prepared for the uptick in immediate demand. And at the end, you're seeing a mismanagement of essentially strength. So they're due to fatigue, due to volume, due to frequency, whatever version or variable you want to put into, ultimately it led to a decrease in strength and likely a decrease in kinetic energy, which is then an uptick in kinetic energy somewhere else. So what I mean by that is if my legs are gassed, if my hips are sore, if my hips are tired, if my torso is tired or whatever, and the kinetic energy is low for my lower half, my torso is going to feel that and actually pick up speed to try and equate out the same velocity. And ultimately that's where you end up leading to massive injuries. It's just because you have these varying forces all of a sudden out of nowhere. So is there a correct inning? Is there a correct pitch count? I think pitch count's a terrible thing. I think it's hurt baseball more than it's helped baseball. Simply because of the fact that, well, that's not true at the younger levels, but as you get higher up, I think more coaches are aware, more parents are aware. So I think they're less likely to just roll a kid out there for, 150 pitches. But I think that it's created this stigma that I can only throw X amount of pitches where, like we talked about before, you need to overload in order to create a positive change. And yes, there needs to be a recovery period, right? It's overload, recover, overcompensate. That's like the general path towards, adaptation. The idea is if I'm only throwing 80 pitches, then all of a sudden, if I throw 100, of course that's too much. But if I've ever, progressed towards these things, recovered from them, gradually pushed these envelopes, I should be able to do that. I don't necessarily think volume is our problem. I think strength is more of our problem. And I think mismanaging that strength is the biggest issue. We see injuries from lazy kids, kids that stop testing themselves during the season because they get excited at the success they're having and they fall away from their routines. Lazy is probably the wrong word. That's probably a little harsh, but the idea, but everybody is guilty of it, right? You could have the most phenomenal morning routine in the world. Everything starts going right. Everything's killing it. And you're like, oh, I can relax a little bit. I can fall off this. I'll be fine. Then the wheels start to fall off. And now you're trying to rush back to that same routine. Well, that's the same thing we see a lot of times from guys when they start to ignore their testing. Like, we do use the Arm Care app quite a bit to test our guys. Is it foolproof? Absolutely not. Nothing is. Does it at least give us a good baseline to go off of and some good indications? That, with a couple other markers, really does help to mitigate injury. But ultimately, there is one factor that is the most important in any injury situation, and that is communication. That is the leading factor towards injuries. It is a lack of communication, trust, or just like cohesiveness between the coaching staff and the player.
Last question I have before we get to our last 3 outs. Recovery, pitching recovery. What are your recommendations? Ice? No, I hear no one wants to ice anymore. We want to do sprints. We want to, we don't want to do pulls anymore. We want to do, we're Ferrari. We're not a Prius. So tell us what you think is the best recovery for these young athletes.
Weight train right away. Honestly, do what you've consistently done right away. Don't magically change some things. Ice, yes, can have very detrimental processes. You need inflammation. You need inflammation as part of the healing process, right? We need inflammation to create hypertrophy, to create muscle growth. You need inflammation in your body at certain times. So blunting that by icing isn't necessarily the positive that everybody wants it to be. Ibuprofen, throw that in the same boat right there. If you have swelling that's gone on for several days, sure, start to add that stuff in and probably get to a doctor. But, if you have these scenarios where you're like, hey, I really like running long distance because it clears my head after I throw, great. It's not going to be this detrimental thing to you where all of a sudden you're going to lose 3 miles an hour. It's just not. I think most of the time what we see after a pitching event that gets guys into trouble is they do too much arm care. So they just took an area in the shoulder and forearm that ran a marathon, and then they went and trained it, right? No marathon runner is coming out and lifting legs as soon as they get out of the marathon. So it's the same concept here. There's a lot of other ways that we can use, things like isometrics to at least time it and get the muscle feeling good, get blood flow in the area. But ultimately, you want to stick to your normal routine. And for many of these guys, their normal routine should be either that night or the next, I wouldn't even say the next day, but that night, if possible, to get a sizable lift in so that the next day can be a true recovery day. The biggest mistake is throwing, then lifting really heavy the next day, then going out and long tossing the day after. And it's like, well, wait a minute, when did I recover from this really intense bout that I had? Right? So the objective is really that if I'm going to lift heavy, I want to do that lift heavy on a really high output day from a throwing perspective. I don't necessarily want to do it on the next day. Because remember, we're just dealing with central nervous system fatigue, right? Whether it's peripheral fatigue in the muscles or whether it's actual central nervous system fatigue, you're dealing with some of that if it's continuously, pushing you down, 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 down.
We got to ask you the last 3 outs. They're the hardest questions we ask. So be prepared.
All right.
So first things first, what is your favorite food?
Pizza.
Just regular, pepperoni?
Yeah, love it.
You're in New York. Where's the best pizza joint?
Oof. Listen, I'm partial to like my hometown one right there. So probably Maria's Pizza in Yorktown is great.
Maria's Pizza, Yorktown. You heard it here. Maria's Pizza. Get VeloU some pizza.
Yeah.
Favorite movie?
I got this the other day. Somebody asked me this. Remember the Titans?
Favorite baseball player ever, alive or dead?
Derek Jeter.
The captain.
Yeah.
The GOAT.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
I mean,
The fact
easy
that he
one.
wasn't unanimous is absolutely ridiculous.
I think that's on purpose, but you know.
I don't care. That guy should.
Yeah, it just like I think people discredit a little bit what he meant to an entire city, what he meant to the game of baseball. I mean, Yankees are the most storied baseball team ever. To have a guy that can lead that at a young age like that in that city, I mean, people discredit what it takes to do that.
No, he was amazing. He was the guy. I mean,
and on top of performing in the highest situations all the time.
100%. Dr. Nick, you are the man. Where can our followers and listeners follow you and find you?
VeloUniversity.com, VeloU, or I think it's VeloU University also on Instagram. I'm sure it's the same thing on TikTok. At Coach_Serio, I believe. On Instagram is my personal one, but you see most of it on VeloU as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here today. Ton of great stuff. We got to have you in for a part 2.
Sure. Love it. Thank you, guys.
We got to get you on again.
Hey, guys. Dr. Nicholas Serio here. Hope you enjoyed that podcast. If you don't mind, like, follow, and subscribe to Baseball Playground.